Hey, what's going on? My name's Vit, and in this video we're going to be taking a look back at the entire past expansion in Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker, and kind of just looking back at all of the different raids from this past expansion. There's about 24 of them, so this might be a bit of a long video, but we'll be looking at Extreme, Savage, and Ultimate, and then we'll be throwing them all into a little tier list. That's mainly to help me organize my thoughts a bit with all these different fights, see where things rack up, see which ones I prefer, which ones I don't. But people love a good tier list as well, so it should make for a fun little video. But here is the look. Here's a look at the tier list. Again, 7 extreme trials, 12 savage raids, plus the phase 2 of each raid tier, the final fight in each raid tier, and then we got 2 ultimates, DSR and top. So we'll be going over all of these. I just kind of want to talk about what I liked, what I didn't like about each of them, showcase some of the interesting mechanics, or at least talk about the interesting mechanics. I don't have footage of all of the extreme and savage versions of these fights, unfortunately. I'm still new to YouTube. I don't have years worth of recordings of all of my time spent raiding, unfortunately. So the other night on stream, I got a few people from the Discord. If you're not in there, feel free to join. There should be a link below. But we ran the normal versions of all of these fights just to have something to show in this video. So you're not going to see every savage and extreme mechanic. I don't even have footage of the second phases, so we're just going to talk about those. But I do have this cool little website, thepfstrat.com. We're going to use this as a bit of a visual aid as well for some of the different fights. They've got a bunch of diagrams and strats in here that are pretty popular in Party Finder. It's a cool little website. It doesn't have every fight complete, but it'll be a good little thing to look at in addition to the video that I was able to get. So the other thing I want to preface this video by saying is that I am not a world first raider. I'm not a hardcore raider. I'm pretty average when it comes to Savage and Ultimate. I was a bit late to the game. This was my first ever expansion, really. I was new to this game at the very tail end of Shadowbringers. So Asphodelos was actually my first ever raid tier, and we didn't even get it done at the time before Abyssos came out. We were a bit late to it. Took a big break to play Elden Ring when that came out as well. And I just didn't end up getting through it all. But so those are the only 2 fights, P3 and P4, that I didn't complete on content. DSR as well, I guess, if you want to say I didn't complete that on content. We just got that done a couple weeks ago, really. But everything else, maybe the first 2 extremes as well. I was a bit late with those. EX3 was my first extreme. So, all that to say, I am not claiming to be the best raider in the world. I'm more just your average guy doing these fights. We raided maybe 3 hours a night at most, maybe 3 nights a week when we were raiding with our group as frequently as I ever did. So, just bear that in mind as I'm going through this. I'm not claiming to be the world's best raider by any means, but I just want to share my thoughts and jump into some of these fights before we go into Dawntrail and have a whole new set of fun fights to get into. So let's just get started with the extremes and start talking about those. Alright, so first on our list is Zodiark. This was the first extreme of the expansion. EX1 and 2, Zodiark and Heidelin, came out right at launch. Like I just mentioned, I did not do these at launch. I did EX3 as my first extreme, and then went back to these pretty much right after. So I didn't get the full launch experience, but close enough. I played them as they were still relatively new. We hadn't totally outgeared them at that point, so I have a good idea of how they were. But I feel like this is just a good middle of the road extreme. Being the first one, it was fun. It was good. I feel like each of these extremes really have one or two mechanical gimmicks to them. That's kind of how the extremes have been structured throughout this expansion, where they have like one or two just really defining mechanics that determine how the fight plays out. Of course, all of them have stacks and spreads and, you know, AoEs that you have to dodge. But the gimmick for Zodiark was the rotating platforms where AoEs would rotate around and you had to be in the right spot. Recognizing that was fairly challenging, but it wasn't, you know, the most difficult thing in the world. And then the other mechanic was the one with the constellations in the sky, where you'd have to look up and see where the stars are in the sky on each angle, and then they would kind of like fold down onto the arena. I thought that was really cool as well. The only downside of this fight really is that it's a big purple wall boss, which becomes a bit of a theme. I think Zodiark, Endsinger, and Zeromus all feel very similar thematically, which kind of hurts them as the expansion went on. By the end, it's like, oh, okay, just another giant purple wall boss. Kind of tired of this by now. But Zodiark being the first one, it was cool. I didn't have any complaints. The other downside about this fight is that you could really just follow a single player that knew what they were doing for the entire fight. You put the safety Dorito on somebody's head and just follow them around and you can get through this fight no problem. Which is not really the case for too many others. But for this one, again, it's the first extreme. You can't ask too much. I think a solid middle-of-the-road B tier is fair. It's not bad. It's not amazing. But it was a fun fight. I thought it was a cool boss design, cool arena. The rotating platform definitely hurt a lot of people's brains, mine included, when it first came out. And it was just a fun fight overall. Good start. Okay, the next fight on the list for the extremes is Hydaelyn. This was a great fight. I'm going to put it in A tier. Now, the reason for that is that it just had a whole lot more going on. Not being a wall boss helps a lot, for sure. The design of this fight was just beautiful. The big gimmick was, in my opinion, the light waves that would come through and you would have to line of sight them behind the little crystals. I thought that was really interesting. There was a really interesting part later on in the fight where you had to split up behind different crystals based on whatever role, so like tanks, healers, DPS. And then those light waves would blast out and you'd be hiding behind the crystals and doing all that while the fight's going on. It was just really fun. There was an interesting little adds mechanic where you had to fight the crystals in the middle of the fight as well. Lots of, you know, in-out mechanics. There was the interesting chakram dodge where you had to kind of sidestep in an interesting way. Kind of Exaflare style, like 3-to-1 dodge it. So that was really cool. Just an overall really solid fight. I don't think it's S tier because it didn't really have anything crazy going on for it, but it was just a beautiful fight, really well done. And as the second fight in the expansion, second extreme in the expansion at least, and it ended up being one of the higher difficulty extremes in my opinion. Not anywhere near the hardest one, but on the upper half for sure. So it was just fun to do this fight over and over again, because a lot of these extremes you have to farm out for the mount. So that's another thing to consider, is the replayability of the extreme raids at least. Because you might be doing them 50 times for that mount, and I definitely did. I farmed out all these, so that was a fun one. It's solid A tier for me. Alright, next fight on the list we have Endsinger. Now, this fight kind of got the short end of the stick in that the normal mode version actually almost has a whole second phase that's not included in the extreme, unfortunately. It's when all of the Scions come in, have all their voice lines. I can see why that's not in the extreme. It would get a little tiring doing that on repeat. But it was missing out. You miss all that cool second phase music. The whole arena changes in the normal mode. None of that happens in extreme. And then right after the previous two fights, this one was just kind of, like I said before, similar thematically to Zodiark as far as, you know, just the color scheme, having a big wall boss. Obviously, the mechanics were different. The main gimmick of this fight was the rewind mechanic, so you kind of had to pay attention to things and then see how many mechanics back the boss would rewind, and then they would kind of all go off at the same time, and you had to be in the right spot. So that was really cool. There were some interesting puzzle mechanics in this fight. It's not a bad fight at all. I think people just kind of got a bad taste for it because they cut out a lot of what was in normal mode. I think if it had that normal mode music, it would be a way stronger fight. It wasn't particularly difficult or anything, but the planets mechanic, where the planets would collide on outside the arena and cause a giant AoE on launch, this would just one-shot you if you were caught in those. And it was very easy at first to not be in the right spot and just die to that. So there was some challenge, at least as a new player myself. I don't think this was a bad fight by any means. I think it's pretty much the same as Zodiark for me. I think it has more interesting mechanics. I'll put it above Zodiark even, but both in B tier. Endsinger was an awesome boss design. I think they just dropped the ball a bit on the extreme version, despite it having very fun mechanics. Next up, we have Barbariccia. Now, this is my favorite extreme from this expansion. This fight was just so hectic. The mechanics were not particularly challenging, but everything was just at such a chaotic, fast pace where you were just having to dodge bullet hell, AoEs coming at you. There was just... It was just chaotic. I don't know. There's no better way to describe it. There were some really interesting tether mechanics where you would get paired with a partner and tethered together inside of like a circle, and if you like stepped outside the circle or stretched your tether too far, it would give you a dot and deal damage. You'd end up dying probably. You had to like spread with these tethers in Proteans, and like you'd get the PlayStation markers above your heads where you'd have to pair with your matching partner. There were just some really interesting mechanics in there. Again, nothing crazy, but just the pace of this fight made it such a highlight. The boss was such a unique design as well, with all the different animations. There's a lot of fun movement as well, lots of in-out type stuff. The boss would jump to the wall, you'd have to be behind the cleave and then spread. There's so many different variations on things in this fight that it's hard to remember them all. There was the Mario Kart mechanic where you'd run around dropping AoEs and then have to like bait AoEs in the middle and then spread out to your clock spots. Again, nothing that's like too difficult, but just the pace of this fight really made it, in my opinion. It was just fun. Again, I'm playing melee here, so if you were on caster or something, maybe you don't like this fight as much. Caster or healer, but as a melee, that fight was a blast. Just running around, dodging all of the different attacks that she was throwing out. I think this is easily the best extreme. Maybe not the hardest one. Once you get used to the mechanics and get used to the pacing of it, it's pretty smooth, actually. Nothing's really too scary. Things are recoverable. But once you jump in there for the first time, it's definitely overwhelming, and in a good way. The music's hectic, the boss's attacks are hectic and chaotic, and I just had a whole lot of fun with this one. Okay, and I just said the last boss was fun on melee. This next one is the complete opposite. We have Rubicante. He was not pleasant as a melee, and especially so as a Dragoon before they made the change where you could jump while being bound. Because this fight has the one mechanic where you get bound in place, you're locked to the ground when those pizza slices come out, for lack of a better term. The lines on the ground that would kind of point to whatever was going off, either like a half-room cleave or a conal coming off the wall. And you would just get locked in place while that was happening. As a melee, you can't go for positionals. As a Dragoon, when the fight came out, you couldn't use your jumps because you're locked to the ground. So you had to like try to squeeze them all out beforehand. or you'd miss them in your burst. It was a pain, but it was kind of fun. But there were definitely frustrations there as a melee player. I don't think this was a bad fight at all. I think that pizza slice mechanic was a bit overplayed throughout the fight. It ended up being just memorize the patterns and you pretty much resolve it. You could also just follow your party if somebody knew where they were going. Just mark them, follow them, which kind of hurts that fight in a big way. There were other fun mechanics as well in the second half of the fight. There was the limit cut at the end where you got marked with the numbers above your head and you had to pass tethers around while taking cleaves in front of the boss. That was pretty fun. Later on, you just skip that mechanic, unfortunately, nowadays, but during launch, that was a really fun part of the fight to see, to get right. Just felt good to do. And there were some other fun little spread mechanics. I don't know, this was not a bad fight by any means. I just think that pizza slice mechanic, I forget what it's called. I think that was a bit overused throughout it. We could have done with a bit less of that. I don't think this is worse than Zodiark or Endsinger by any means. I think it's up there in B tier with these two. I think I personally had more fun with Rubicante than I did these other two fights, so I'm going to put him at the top of B tier for now. It was a fun fight. Just maybe less so on Melee. Okay, second to last of the extremes, we have Golbez, and I personally think this was the most difficult of the extreme trials from this expansion. I'm personally going to put this in S tier. I loved this fight. The design of it was awesome, the boss is cool, the arena's cool, but outside of that, it did have some genuinely challenging mechanics. I played this fight on Ninja, so a lot of the uptime that you're forced to work around, because a lot of the mechanics kind of have you disengage and try to like hit the boss from range. I was on Ninja and it wasn't really a big deal with all the mudras, so that was fun. But there were some genuinely tough parts of this fight. Things like the gales, where there were kind of line AoEs coming from each side of the arena, and you had to dodge those while doing like pairs or stacks at the same time. There were those like exaflare type meteors that circled around the arena that you had to dodge kind of out and then back in, and then stack in pairs. That was really cool. Some of the just like out and stack mechanics, there was a whole bunch of like pair stacks and light party stack mechanics throughout this fight, but they were always paired with something else happening. It wasn't just go stack with your light party. That would be too simple. With this fight, it was always two things happening at the same time. And just the pacing of the fight really built upon itself. It started out fairly slow and got more and more difficult as it went on. I think that pacing in this fight was some of the best, whereas Barbariche just started out fast and stayed fast the whole time, which was really cool. This fight had a nice smooth ramp in difficulty. There was also that one knockback mechanic where somebody would have to stand in the middle with the knockback marker, and then there would be two flares going to each corner, and then two stacks in the other corner. That was one that always went wrong in PF. So this fight just took a lot of coordination, more so than a lot of the other extremes did, in my opinion. It wasn't the most difficult fight by any means. It was still an extreme for sure, but I think it did overall have the toughest of any of the other fights mechanics. And I just really liked it. I don't know. It was a fun fight on all rolls, in my opinion. Even the normal mode is just a fun fight to jump in on. And Golbez is awesome, so that helps the cause a lot. And it's funny because we went from, in my opinion, the hardest of the extremes to potentially the easiest, or one of the easiest, with the next one. Okay, last but not least for the extremes, or maybe least for the extremes, we have Zeromus. To me, this fight was just the most forgettable of all of them. Unfortunately, because it's such a cool boss. It's such a old FF throwback boss. along with some of the others, of course, but we had a bunch of FF4 content in the post-Endwalker patches. But Zeromus, for me, it just takes what Endsinger and Zodiark already did, doing it yet again for a third time. This one's going in C tier for me. It was nice and easy. The only real struggle in this fight is the meteor mechanic, where everybody gets tethered, and they have to fan out without hitting other meteors, but there's 2 sets of them, so everybody has to like make room for each other. It's very tight. It's way tighter than it should be. And it just doesn't really feel like the right kind of difficulty, especially for an extreme. One thing that I really don't like in this game is when they require you to be just pixel perfect. If you take a step in the wrong direction, it's like game over, everybody wipes. I don't find that fun personally. We saw a lot of that in the most recent raids here with like P12, P2, and even P11 to some extent with the max melee range stuff going on there. But I don't know, this fight just was kind of just another Zodiark Endsinger, but even easier potentially with less going on. There were some fun bits in it, but it's in C tier for me. I was just kind of sick of that style fight by the end. There's not much else to say about it. The meteor mechanic I found more annoying than fun or challenging. It was just too precise for extreme party finder. People got it done. People got used to it, you know. It was fine. But I don't know. It was just not the most fun mechanic, and that was like the mechanic of the fight. And outside of that, it was pretty straightforward. Stack spread. I guess you had to dodge the bio attack. That was kind of cool. There was the acceleration bomb type attack where you had to like stand still, don't press any buttons. Not a particularly exciting mechanic either, so I don't know. This fight is just at the bottom for the extremes for me personally, but it was nice and easy. Not a bad way to wrap things up. I would have preferred something more in the S or A tier type fights, something along these lines more so, but I'll take what I can get. For all the extremes, it's really not too bad. Some of these might be a little high. Maybe we could bump Zodiark down into C tier as well. But I don't know. I think these two are in a good spot. So I'm pretty happy with this overall. But now we're moving into Savage. I'm not going to rank these left to right with Savage and Extreme. I'll try to do left to right for each difficulty, but I am not ranking Extreme against Savage per se, if that makes sense. So I'm not going to say like P3S is better than Zeromus, you know what I mean? So we'll jump into the Savage now, and there's a lot to go over. Okay, first Savage fight of the expansion, and my first ever time doing Savage. Maybe that will have me be a bit biased. Maybe I'm looking back with rose-tinted glasses. But I liked this fight. It's not bad. I think it's kind of in a similar vein as Zodiark, where it's just a good middle-of-the-road fight. There's nothing really wrong with it. There's nothing amazing about it, but it's a good first fight. This was my introduction to Savage, and it's definitely a step up from a lot of Extreme, at least the ones that at the same time that this was released, being, you know, Zodiark, Heidelin, and maybe Endsinger, I believe, was at the same time. But it was just fun. There were a lot of cool mechanics in it. The Shackles mechanic, where you would have the purple or the red debuffs, and you had to kind of spread out close or far from the boss. That was fun. It helped me learn how to read debuffs and, you know, position correctly in, you know, your clock spot with your pair, with your partner, your color partner. Intemperance, which was the fire and ice mechanic, I believe that's what it's called. That was really cool too. You had to kind of flex, or at least one person had to flex with the tank to soak the correct fire or ice to balance out your buffs. The party finder, of course, came up with the ingenious strat to just have the tank take a damage down to make it easier. Not great, but it is what it is. I'm not going to fault the fight for that, just party finder. Always blame party finder. But I don't think that hurts the fight. I think that was a cool mechanic. There were a lot of fun, like, out and in while doing those mechanics as well. Reading which chain he had, whether he had the mace or, like, the sickle type thing. Told you if it was going to be out or in, and saw which side of the boss to be on. As well as being on that dartboard with the fire or ice colors in the later parts of the fight. There were some cool tank mechanics as well. I don't want to get too involved in every single mechanic of all of these Savage fights or we'd be here forever, but I don't know. This was just a really good introduction to Savage raiding for me. I did this a little bit after the tier had already been out, but I got it done and it was a blast. So solid middle of the road for me. Try not to be too biased either way. But I don't think it's bad. I don't think it's amazing. There's definitely better and worse fights than P1S. Okay, next fight from Asphodelos, P2S, or the Hippocampus, I believe. Excuse me if I screw up any of these names that I haven't thought about in years now. But this was a blast. This fight was so good. It had such a unique arena that they experimented with. This was a boss with no positionals, which was pretty much required because of the way that the arena was laid out. It really blocked off certain parts of the arena, and there was just no way you'd be able to get behind the boss at certain times of the fight. So I think that was a good move. For me, this fight's going in A tier. It's not S tier because it really doesn't have anything insane about it. It's pretty straightforward. It's really just that arena that carries this fight. There were some really fun mechanics as well. There was the one where you get like the waves behind you and you have to crash into the player from across from you. You have to like line up correctly. Everybody kind of collides in the middle. That was fun. The limit cut mechanic in this fight was just another limit cut basically, but because of the way the arena was laid out, you had to spread in such a way that was just pretty unique. It was just fun to do. In my opinion, there were a lot of spread mechanics, and the boss would kind of cleave different halves of the arena, and you would have to be in the safe spot. Lots of spread mechanics. There were some fun tether mechanics. I don't know, just pretty standard stuff for how mechanics work in Savage in this game. Nothing too out there, but the arena really carried it, in my opinion. Hippocampus was just a fun fight to do. It wasn't particularly difficult, but I think it was a step up from P1S, for me at least, in my Savage learning experience. So it was just a nice progression after that first fight, where things didn't ramp up too much, but I don't know. It was just a solid fight, good fun. I was going to say good, clean fun, but you were hanging out in the sewer, so maybe not. A bit of an interesting boss design. It was just fun, though. I really loved that fight, but I think there's just, you know, some complexity that keeps it out of S tier. Again, it's only a second turn fight, so you can't expect too much from it. Although later on, second turn fights, P10S has something to say about that, but we'll get to that. So yeah, A tier for me for P2S. Okay, now this is probably where the hot takes start. P3S for me is S tier. And it's funny because this is the only fight on this list that I have not completed to this day. Now, before you start angrily typing comments, I just love this fight. I know it's orange, it's like staring at the sun, but I don't know, it somehow didn't affect me. I was able to see past the blinding orange light of this fight for what it is. It has incredible mechanics throughout. If you can put your sunglasses on and play this fight without going blind, it's not like, I don't know. Maybe it's painful to look at, but that's part of the fun. This fight is genuinely difficult. In my opinion, this is what a third turn Savage fight should be. Now going back to the fact that I never cleared it, I was in a very casual static with a bunch of new players. We were also very late to the tier. We were well over the halfway point for this raid tier. We pretty much ran up until Abyssos. When Abyssos launched, we were still in this fight trying to learn it. We got most of the way through. I was actually raid leading that group for the most part. making diagrams, trying to like explain every mechanic to every last person in the group, trying to like specifically tell them where they needed to be for everything. Which was a good experience for me because I was still new to the game. I was still learning myself. So maybe there's a lot of bias here, but I do think this is a great fight. We were able to get most of the way through the fight. I know how this entire fight works. If I went back in there today, I'd probably remember it all. I spent so much time in this fight trying to get everybody else through it. I was never really one to party finder outside of our static group to try to prog ahead or whatever. We were just hanging out with our friends, having fun. So it was a good time. But I think this fight genuinely has some really incredible mechanics. Everything from the ads phase onwards is just great. There are some mechanics in this fight that are even ultimate level, in my opinion. After doing top and DSR, there are mechanics in this fight that are just as difficult. Obviously not the entire fight, but some later stuff gets really tricky. Flames of Asphodelos, I believe, where the tornadoes come up and everybody has to bait them a different direction while there's like tank tethers coming out. There's like 4 different things that need to be baited at the same time. There's the one knockback from the one tornado that you have to get knocked into 2 different light parties to the different tornadoes, which then have like a donut AoE around them, and you have to spread in that donut in your light parties. Like, some of the mechanics in this fight are actually insane if you go back and think about them. Flames of Asphodelos, I believe, is the one where you would drop the birds and have to like stretch the tethers across the arena. That was incredibly difficult to do without clipping people as well, at least as a new player. Maybe if I went back and did this now, it'd all be easier after all the experience I've gained in this expansion. The healer towers were really interesting, where they would get a healing buff and be able to just top everybody off with like a single button. That was fun. The ads phase in this fight, people might dislike it, but I thought it was really cool. The tanks had to like pull 2 ads around the arena and drop them in specific spots on each cardinal, basically. And then they would grow and tether to players, and you had to try to keep uptime and do enough damage to meet the DPS check on the ads while they're dashing back and forth across the arena. You had to like sidestep them as they're dashing. It just had a whole lot going on. This was like the first difficult damage check in the game for us as well. That ads phase specifically, like we struggled with that. We were all very new. We didn't know what we were doing at the time, but we got through it. We were progging the later mechanics of the fight. We never got it done. Still to this day, it's a fight I've never done. I need to go back in there and do it at like min item level. I can't talk right now. But I don't know, this fight was just something special. I think I even saw Enrage in Party Finder, like as that tier was coming to a close, but I just never got it done. So that's my one regret from this expansion, not spending more time in that fight, because I really do think it's incredible if you can get past the orange color of it. Okay, now we've got P4S, Phase 1 and 2. Obviously, if I didn't finish P3S, I didn't finish this one either. I never even touched this fight when it was current, but I have since gone back and cleared P4S to unlock DSR. We went through during Abyssos when we were overgeared and cleared this fight, so take my opinions with a grain of salt. I think we experienced, 90% of what this fight had to offer. Maybe the very final mechanics in each one. We didn't really have to fight the DPS check, so it is what it is. I ended up learning all of the mechanics, though. We were able to clear this in a single, maybe lockout and a half, with some people who already knew the fight. But for me personally, Phase 1 was not the most interesting fight. I'm actually going to put this in C tier again. Don't take my opinion too strongly here, because I only did this once. A lot of other people spent a lot more time in here, but I know a lot of people will probably agree that this is not the strongest of the final turn Phase 1 fights. Pinax was interesting in how it worked. There was the rot mechanic where you had to pass the rot debuffs and pass around tethers. But outside of those 2 things, there wasn't a whole lot going on. Pin-X was pretty interesting. There were some struggles with uptime and buff alignment during that, from what I understand. I don't know. Just this fight didn't grab me from the look of it and from mechanically how it worked. So it's just going to go in C tier for me. Again, maybe it's better than that. I didn't get a full chance to experience it, but I think Phase 2 was a much more interesting fight. I actually really like this fight a lot. I'm going to put this in A tier for me. Again, only did it one time, so maybe it's worse, maybe it's better. But for me, this boss design was incredible. One thing I haven't really touched on is music in a lot of these fights. A lot of the extremes have it really good, but a lot of Asphodelos kind of struggled. P4S Phase 1 had some incredible music. P2, kind of forgettable. But the fight itself was really cool. There was a lot of interesting movement in this fight with the stakes and, you know, tower soaks. Just the way you had to move around to soak towers, to stack with your group, to stretch tethers. There was the mechanic where the boss would jump to one side and knock back other players. You'd have to anti-knockback it and soak towers, while the other part of the group would bait earth shakers from the boss. Some of the later mechanics where you kind of run around the boss stretching tethers. It was just really interesting. This was a fun second phase for me. I personally think it's the easiest of the second phase final turn fights from the Savage fights this expansion. Maybe A tier is a little bit too high. I might bump it back down to B now that I think about it, but just based on where some of the other ones fall. But I don't know, this was just such a cool boss design. It was such a cool conclusion for the first raid tier. It really had a good ramp throughout the different mechanics, Act 1 through 4, and then Curtain Call at the end. To this day, Act 2, it seems so complicated with how it works, but when you were actually in there doing it, it really wasn't too bad. And then at the end of the fight, it also had the mechanic where you just have to know how to count to 8. I believe it was 8, not 4. But you basically just count when you get hit. And as long as you can count to 8, you can complete that last mechanic. That was always funny. So I always appreciate some good memes like that in these fights. But again, I just didn't spend enough time in P4S to really have a solid opinion. But from what I've seen, I've been watching streams of these fights throughout the entire expansion when they came out, watching the Race to World First stuff and just watching other streamers prog them and do them. So I have a good idea how everything works, even though I didn't do this on content myself. But again, those are the only two fights that I missed out on, P3 and P4. The rest I have plenty of experience with, so we'll put those there for now. If you disagree, totally fair. I will admit that I don't really know what I'm talking about with this fight. So it is what it is. Okay, now we get to Abyssos, which is where I got more serious about raiding in this game. Before we get into that, I'm just going to move this over here with Ericthonios, so just to keep Extreme and Savage separate. But the first fight, P5S, we had Proto Carbuncle, and this was one of my favorite fights. This is going in S tier for me. I think the bird, Phoenix, is still better. But as a first turn of this tier, this was an incredible fight. I had so much fun with this one throughout the entire tier. Devour was such a meme at the start in PF. That was a blast. I was still with my casual group at this point. That lasted through P7S, and then we eventually broke up in P8, and I found a more serious group to clear the tier with. So this tier also took me longer than it should have, but it is what it is. I was still having fun raiding with friends at this point, not trying to get things done ASAP. Kind of still the same position I'm in now. So, I don't know. Carbuncle was just a solid fight. There were a lot of fun tank swaps. Venomous Mass became a meme. Devour became a meme. This was just the tier full of memes. This was the most entertaining raid tier for me, and it started off on the right foot. The mechanics where he would put up that crystal barrier and reflect things throughout the fight in different ways was really interesting. It kept you on your toes. There was interesting movement and positioning in this fight. It was just a very involved first turn fight for a raid tier. This is what a first turn should be, in my opinion. There's not much else to say, really. It's just, this was a very fun fight to prog. Again, I was still with my casual group, so it was tough. I think I went into PF and cleared this one week 1, even though we were moving at a very slow pace. But just the struggles with Devour and the tank busters, getting clipped by those poisons, having them in the wrong place. There was good PvP potential in pretty much every fight in this raid tier, which is funny. Yeah, I don't know, not much else to be said. It was just a blast. The music in this tier, Silent Scream, this was the one without the lyrics, is one of my favorite songs. I like the version with no lyrics more. And then P6 and P7 had the lyrics. So, I don't know, you had good music this whole tier. Every fight in this game, P8, 1 and 2, had incredible music as well, but this was just such a strong start to me taking raiding seriously in this game, more so. And, you know, maybe a bit of bias, but I think a lot of people love this fight as well. And it's just an easy S tier for me. And now we get to the 2 fights that are some of the most hated by the community, P6 and P7. We'll just talk about 6 for now. For me, I didn't hate this fight. I had fun with it, personally. But we'll put it in C tier. I know it's not great. This is one of those fights where every mechanic looks very similar, which is not a good thing. It's hard to tell where you're at in the fight sometimes. There were the mechanics where things would just like move around on the floor, the different shapes, and they would just swap positions and you had to be on the right tile. And it just became a memorization game by the end of it, where you would just know which tile to stand on. There were a few options, but it became very tiring. And there was Cachexia, which was a cool mechanic where you had to spread around the boss, get hit, move in, bait and AoE. It was very easy to clip people. It was kind of annoying, but it wasn't a bad mechanic. This fight was just, it was not in a great place in a balance perspective, because one of the final mechanics, everybody would just tank LB it, and you would stand in the wrong spot and it wouldn't matter. You could clear this fight with like well over 10 deaths. It was just not balanced well. That plus all of the very samey mechanics really just hurt this one, I think. It had some cool stuff going for it. The design was really cool. I personally don't like mechanics where you have to face a certain direction, but that's just me playing on controller, I guess. But there was that where you had the conal AoE coming out of your front or back, depending if you had the head or the tail attached to you. The little parasite that the boss gives. So there was some cool stuff going on, but I don't know. I feel like they just didn't hit this one home. It didn't land like it should have. It was still fun. There was the mechanic where you would get either a stack or a spread, and then they could swap if you were tethered to somebody else. You either had to be out in the corner or under the boss. And the boss was either cleaving left, right, or front, back, and you'd have to kind of rotate. But I don't know, this fight, you could make too many mistakes and still get through it. There's a balance that needs to be struck where you can make a few mistakes, but if you make too many, you're going to hit enrage. But this fight, it felt like it just kept going on, and like things would repeat too much, and you could really just scrape by, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I don't know. It wasn't very challenging. And as a second turn fight, when you look at the other tiers, you have P2S, Hippocampus, and P10S, Pandemonium. Hegemony just does not hold up at all. It's C tier is maybe being generous. That might be a D tier fight. I personally still had fun with it because I was still somewhat new to raiding. So I'm going to keep it in C. The design was cool. The music was incredible. This was the first fight with the full song Scream with the lyrics. So it was just nice to be in there. It looked cool. But just the samey mechanics got a bit tiring. Now, the other fight that everybody loves to hate or just hates is P7S. For me, I think I actually liked this one more than P6S, but it's still down there close to the bottom. It's not quite D tier. I still had fun with this fight. The only issue with this fight is that it's so backloaded. The first 7 minutes almost have nothing going on. There's also the one mechanic halfway through. I forget what it was called. We can pull up PF strat real quick. I believe it was Purgation. The Sleepo Cat strat. Yeah, Purgation. Where this strat just cheesed the mechanic. Like, this is... we don't think this was the intended way, but you'd basically just run back and forth between these platforms, and it kind of ruined this whole mechanic. The way you were supposed to do it had people on the south platform and bouncing back and forth. There was a whole lot more movement. It was still quite a lot of movement, but I don't know. That's one thing like that would have been more interesting earlier on in the fight if we didn't have that strat. So I think that made the first half of that fight simpler than it needed to be or was intended to be, which kind of hurt it a little bit. Other than that, there really wasn't much going on. It was another fight with a very interesting arena. And it was used pretty well, in my opinion. But the last third of the fight, when the harvests came out, it felt like the fight doubled in difficulty, and you were already almost 10 minutes into the fight at that point, so it made it very frustrating for people to prog it. Like I said, I enjoyed the first half of the fight. It was fun running around this platform, at least as melee. If I was a caster, maybe a different story. But I don't know. Those harvests at the end, they were a bit rough. I think they could have been spread out throughout the fight, and it would have felt like a much more full, well-rounded fight. Because they weren't too bad. There was just a lot of very specific positioning where if you were slightly out of place, one of those big minotaurs would cleave and clip somebody else, or if you were tethered to one of the birds, it would, clip somebody else and knock them off the platform, or there were a million different ways to PvP your party in this fight, and it was all 10 minutes into the fight, so it wasn't great. It just felt really bad to die at the end of the fight. The DPS check was actually pretty tough, at least early on. So if anybody died, it was kind of game over. So it was just a rough fight to prog. Another one that just wasn't really balanced super great, but not in the sense that it wasn't tuned for the damage. It was more just that it wasn't planned out well, and that the mechanics were at weird times. It wasn't spread out well throughout the timeline. It was still a fun fight. It felt really good pulling off some of those later mechanics. I really didn't hate it. I think a lot of the mechanics were much more interesting than P6S, in my opinion. But when you compare this to P3S, the previous third turn from the previous tier, it's just like, I don't know. There's nothing going on. It's a big wall boss. You don't have to move the boss at all. You just kind of run around the arena freely. And I don't know. It was a lot of stack spread stuff. It's definitely not one of the stronger fights, but I still had fun with it personally. Got the same good music as the previous fight, so it was always nice to chill in there, but it definitely got frustrating, but still somehow better than P6S in my opinion. Okay, and for the last of the fights for Abyssos, we have P8S, Phase 1, and Phase 2. Now, where P6 was unbalanced in the sense that it was maybe a little too easy, not tuned up high enough, P8 on launch was not well balanced in that it was too difficult. You had to have the perfect raid comp, you had to play perfectly, Luckily for me, I was so slow that that wasn't an issue, but we still fought in rage for our own reasons. But this fight, ignoring all of that, because that was fixed with a slight HP nerf a little ways into the raid tier. If we ignore all that and just focus on the mechanics of this fight, for me, it's A tier. I think I'm going to put it top of A tier above Hippocampus as well. This fight was incredible, phase 1. There were so many cool mechanics going on. I don't even know where to start with this one. Fourfold Fires was awesome, where the snakes would jump out of the ground and you had to be in the right corner of the room, spreading or in pairs. There were some delayed mechanics as well. Early on, they have since buffed the range of party buffs, like Litany or Tech Step, I believe, maybe. Any of those party buffs used to not reach to the other half of the arena where your party was when they would come up. So on launch and early on, you had to really kind of move around your buffs a little bit in order to hit your entire party. There was just a lot going on that you haven't previously had to think about so much in the Savage fights. P8S really challenged my group and eventually killed our casual static. I had to move on to another group at this point to get this one done. But it really helped me learn and improve as a raider. P3S and then this were the two fights each tier that took me to the next level, in my opinion. P8S was just really challenging. I was also raid leading that one with our group, trying to organize where everybody was going, drawing diagrams. And it really just made me hone in on what was happening, gave me more awareness, and, you know, that's a personal thing, of course. Doesn't have anything to do with the fight. But the difficulty of this fight really pushed me to the next level. It was a great experience. I'm just trying to remember some of the mechanics. A lot of the bird and snake or dragon mechanics where it's either in or out. You had to spread to your like quadrants. I don't know. There was a lot going on in this one. The music was incredible. Yeah, the one thing I haven't talked about is the Gorgon mechanic. Gorgomantea, I believe it was. That's a tough one to say, but the snakes. When the snakes pop out, you have to look away. That was the biggest hurdle. You had to look away, and then you had to hit them with the gaze to petrify them, and then somebody else would have to drop a poison on them. That mechanic alone caused so much headache in this fight. Not to even mention the later mechanics where things got slightly more difficult. What keeps this out of S tier is the fact that the timeline was kind of randomized in either that you could get snakes first or dog first. And I'm going to sound insane if you don't know what these mechanics are, but dog basically he transforms into this big four-legged creature that the community referred to as a dog. And if you got, I think it was dog first, your buffs just wouldn't align as they should. So it was not great in how it felt. Maybe it was snakes first. I could be forgetting. It's been a while. But either way, if you get one or the other, it's basically a coin flip each pull to see if your buffs are going to align properly throughout the fight. And if they don't, well, good luck. You might not be meeting that tough damage check as well as you could be if you got the other pattern. So it was a little frustrating there, but it was just such a good fight overall that I can personally look past that, but that does keep it out of S tier for me. If it wasn't for that, I think that would be an easy S tier, P8, P1, but for me, P8, P2 is in S tier. I don't think it's quite as good as these other two. It is just a big wall boss, but it had such interesting mechanics. That whole alchemy thing where you would get the buffs or the colors above your head and you had to combine and fuse with other players was really interesting. This fight was just so epic. The hype of the ending of this fight rivals Ultimate in my opinion, just with the music, with the themes of the fight. some of those final nerve check mechanics, I believe it was called Dominion at the end, where the cracks kind of spread out and you have to soak towers in different orders. It was just super hype, super nerve-wracking, and NA, natural alignment, was one of the earlier mechanics. There were just a lot of cool movement and spread mechanics where you'd bait AoEs on different party members based on where you're standing in relation to one another. This phase was just incredible, in my opinion. It was so unique compared to any of these other fights. Maybe P12, P2 is similar, but I think P8, P2 just did that type of fight in such a better way. The mechanics were so much more rewarding to pull off. It felt way more epic. You would get the same type of Phoenix buff that you get in like UCOB, where everybody dies, the Phoenix reses you. And then in this fight you have a damage buff for the final third of the fight. Final half of the fight, I'm not sure exactly. But you're doing crazy damage at the end. If anybody dies and loses that buff, you're likely not hitting in rage. Or you are hitting in rage, however you want to look at it. But it just added to the hype of this fight. The music was so good. This is the best music out of any raid in this game, in my opinion. Whitestone Black is what the track is called. And it's just got that creepy Resident Evil look to the boss. It's got that, like, industrial electronic type music. Maybe not quite, but I don't know, however you want to call it. It was awesome. This fight was so good. This was the first raid tier that I cleared on content, so maybe I'm biased, but I don't know. P8, P1, and 2 both combined. After we got past those balance issues, once you learn all of the puzzle mechanics in Phase 2, it can be a bit challenging trying to clear Phase 1 to get to Phase 2, but like just in order to prog Phase 2. But, you know, that's the nature of a door boss. I think it just made it that much more rewarding to clear it, having to go through Phase 1 all those times to eventually get that Phase 2 clear. And yeah, I don't know. It just wrapped up what I would say is an incredible tier, even with these 2 fights in the middle that weren't great. But yeah, I don't know. It also had the tree meme where if you combined the 2 alchemy symbols, you could just needlessly make a tree above your head. And of course the community latched onto that, and every PF you would go into would make the tree just for no reason, but it was funny. You had to be there, I guess. But I don't know. It just added on to an already exceptional fight. And that's up there with the other S tiers for me, personally. All right, and we've made it to the final and current raid tier. I say current, but I haven't been in here all year, and it's already May. So maybe it's not that current, but anyway, Anabaseios, P9S, Kokaidos. I'm going to put in A tier. I think he belongs at the bottom of A tier, but this was a fun fight. It was a great first turn. Not as strong as Carbuncle, better than Ericthonios. Lots of interesting mechanics. The fire and ice mechanics throughout were fun. The partner, stack, or spread mechanics were fun. Limit cut in this fight was surprisingly complex for a first turn fight. I think that walled a lot of people at the start of the raid tier. It was pretty tricky, honestly, more so than some of the other limit cuts that we've seen, whether that's from Rubicante or P2S or whatever else. P9S limit cut was actually pretty tough, but outside of that, the fight wasn't too bad. The rest of the fight definitely felt like a first turn, but that limit cut being thrown in here kind of was a bit of a curveball. Overall, just a very fun fight to do. There were some mechanics towards the end as well that were tricky, that would definitely catch you up, but the damage checks in this entire raid tier were not too bad, honestly. So you could kind of scrape by with quite a few mistakes early on even. It was fairly forgiving. which was good because, you know, third tier, we're kind of tired at that point. We had already gone through DSR and top. Not me personally, but, you know, I had been progging top a lot at this point. Going through Abyssos into Anabaseios, we had spent all of that time progging top. I was exhausted at this point. So this tier was nice to kind of just chill through. We got it done nice and quick. I took some breaks during this tier as well, so I didn't get it done fast by any means, but I was in a better group for this tier, and we got through it all without any real struggle, just kind of taking our time. I took a month off during the middle of P12S, so I don't know. It was a fun tier. P12 or P9 is just a solid start to it. Good A tier fight. It was nice and relaxing. The colors of that fight, the music was nice. It was just a chill start to the tier, in my opinion. Next up on the list, we have P10S, and this is the fight that just took everybody by surprise. This is an easy S tier pick, and pretty much everybody will agree with that. I'm putting it at the bottom personally. I think I just favor some of these other ones slightly more. It's surprising still seeing P3S at the top of S tier for me for Savage, but this was such a good second turn. I still think they mixed up the P10 and P11. Those should be reversed in my opinion. P11 should be P10 and P10 should be P11, but it is what it is. This fight was just tough for what it was. It also had that really unique platform, which always goes a long way. It's always nice to see. There was a lot of movement that you could do with the spider webs. Harrowing Hell was a really fun mechanic where it was just such a heal check at the end of the fight that was a real struggle. Placing those spider webs around the platform in the correct spots was always challenging, trying not to get tethered together or tethered to one of the posts on the edge of the arena. The tanks getting knocked out from the tank buster towers and flung across onto those outer platforms never got old. That was funny every time, especially when they would miss and go off into the abyss. I don't know, there's just nothing not to love about this fight. There was plenty of PvP in it, which is always fun. All of the stack spread mechanics were genuinely challenging, especially for a second turn. When you look at the other fights, P2 and P6, P10 is so much more difficult than either of those. There's none of the mechanics are crazy. They're not terribly gimmicky or anything. Some of the ones with the spider webs where you have to place them in certain parts of the arena, maybe a little gimmicky, but it's all pretty intuitive. It's just literally like reading your debuffs in time and knowing where to spread in time gets tough while trying to watch everything else that's going on in this fight. It was just another great step up from the first fight in the raid tier, P9 to P10. It was just fun. It was a real struggle in Party Finder. Our group was able to get through it quickly enough, fortunately, but I don't know. This one was just always entertaining, no matter what. It was a cool arena, cool boss, creepy spider building thing. I don't know how they came up with this one, but one of the most unique boss designs that we've seen in the entire expansion, for sure. This is how you do a wall boss properly, in my opinion. This is how you do a second turn. Maybe a little too difficult. Maybe it could be a third turn. Whereas, you know, Hippocampus is like a real good second turn, in my opinion, but maybe a little too easy. So maybe somewhere in between the two would be the perfect balance, but I don't know. This could have easily been a third turn fight. P10S could have been P11. And I think the tier would have felt more well-rounded because P11, we'll get to that in a second, kind of fell flat after this fight, in my opinion. But overall, P10 is one of the greatest fights this game has ever had, not just this expansion. So, I don't know. These could be realistically in any order in S tier. But for me, I still think I prefer some of these others. This one got slightly tiring, farming it out every week in PF, just because it's tough and people mess up those spreads even any number of weeks into the fight. So I don't know. It was a great fight. I loved it. Easy S tier and easily one of the most memorable fights from the expansion. All right, P11S, and that D tier is looking mighty empty down there. Maybe a hot take, but this was my least favorite fight this entire expansion. It was cool thematically. The boss had a cool design. For me personally, this golden glowing light of this fight was somehow even worse than P3S to look at. And it kind of suffered from the same problem that I had with P6S, where every mechanic looks and feels almost identical to one another. It's always just stack or spread, in or out. The boss dashes through, you're either in light parties or you're in pairs, and that just goes on throughout the entire fight. I don't know, maybe I'm being too hard on this one, maybe it's not that bad, but as a melee, there were also a lot of mechanics where you had to be perfectly at max melee range, and if you were just a pixel too close, you were dead. It was just not the type of difficulty that I enjoy. I didn't think this fight was particularly difficult, but some of that minute positioning is just such a pain sometimes, where a bit more freedom of movement, it doesn't even have to be a lot, just a couple steps in either direction can go a long way, where this fight felt maybe a little too strict. P12S, P2 had a similar problem with some of the mechanics, and it was just getting kind of old at this point with these fights, in this tier specifically. But I don't know, this fight just did not do it for me. It was just a lot of repeat mechanics. There were parts of this fight where your 2-minute burst comes up and literally the boss is doing absolutely nothing for like, I don't know, it felt like 30 seconds to a minute. You're just standing there hitting the boss is just autoing the tank and like nothing's happening. I don't know, dark and light, some of the uptime mechanics were cool, but that's, you know, 30 seconds of the 11-minute fight. It's just too repetitive in my opinion. This one just didn't cut it. I think I enjoyed just about every other fight in this expansion more than this one. It's the fight that I would like to be in the least if I were to go do some rating right now. That's not to say it's a horrible fight. It's still fun, still got it done. Still a lot to enjoy about it. But again, D tier is not, you know, a horrible thing. I'm not saying like, oh, I hate this fight, it's the worst thing ever, I wish it didn't exist. It's fine. I think it could have done things much better. A lot of people complain that this is just a repeat of one of the fights from Eden as well. So I don't know. It's, you know, the design and the music, the theme of the fight, it's great. But mechanically, it just doesn't hold up for me personally. I'm sure many people have a different opinion on that one, but maybe that and P3 are my hot takes. But again, like I said, after P10, going right into P11, P11 just really felt like it didn't hit home like P10 did. So I think just reordering those two would have gone a long way. This would have been an awesome second turn fight. And then going right into what is P10 currently, I think that would have been a better way to do it. Would have, you know, kept this fight feeling better. But it just felt awkward where it was in the tier. And I don't know. I just didn't have as much fun with it as I did any other fight in this game, this expansion. Okay, the last fight of Anabaseios, P12S, Phase 1 and Phase 2. This fight, Phase 1 in particular, was awesome. I'm going to put this in A tier. I think it is likely even better than P8, P1. This was such a solid door boss. Super Chain Theory was a very cool mechanic where you had to really just be reading debuffs constantly. You had to be on the move doing your burst and position yourself in the correct stacks and spreads and proteans based on the different orbs and patterns that are going off. There was just a whole lot going on in a very short amount of time in this fight for all of the different mechanics, really. Each mechanic would hit and it would just be like a burst of activity. Some of the mechanics where there were the dark and light towers that you'd have to soak were really cool. Depending where you would place a tower, somebody else would have to come and soak it. And it was just done really well. The limit cut in this fight was interesting enough. It was a little touchy with some of the positioning and distance. Sometimes it would just do a whole lot of damage if you were just slightly too close, or it was kind of easy to clip people, but I don't think that is the fight's fault. I think it was well tuned in that regard. Some of the later super chains, 2A and 2B, were also really fun at the end of the fight. Those were a pretty good nerves check, in my opinion. This fight was just fast-paced, lots of movement, lots of interesting tower soaks and patterns and partner spreads, partner stacks, group stacks. There was just a lot going on. A lot of debuffs to read. A really awesome boss design, arena, and music. P1 of P12, Phase 1. It's just an incredible fight all around. I think it stays out of S tier for me. It just doesn't reach those highs that some of these fights fit. It could be bottom of S tier. I don't know. I think I'm going to keep it in A tier just because it is a door boss. They do get a little bit annoying when you're trying to prog the second phase and you just have to bash your head against these to get through them, so you can actually make any progress on what you're actually trying to do. I'm not a huge fan of door bosses personally, so I don't know. I know P8 Phase 2's in here, but that's a little different, being the final end of the fight, as opposed to just, you know, having to do the first half over and over again, I guess. But really cool design, really cool music, awesome mechanics throughout. I'm kind of struggling to see why it's not in S tier, other than the fact that it's a door boss. Super Chain was cool. It was cool that you could kind of cheese the first mechanic with tank invuln. Lazy Lasers, I believe it was called. So yeah, I don't know. There's no reason really it shouldn't be in S tier that I see personally. This was a good conclusion to Savage in Endwalker. Unfortunately, Phase 2 is not the same story for me. This fight, I want to put it closer to the bottom, but it's, at the end of the day, it's better than all these C tier fights. It's probably going to end up in B tier. Probably at the bottom for me. I don't know. I'm not thinking too hard about the placement at this point, but I was not a huge fan of this fight. The second phase. Phase 1's great. Phase 2 takes a bit of a nosedive for me. Caloric theory is the main issue that I have with this phase. The spacing is so exact that if you take a step in the wrong direction, the whole party wipes. Obviously, you know, it's not that tight. It's pretty tight, but if you start moving the wrong direction, there's no fixing it, unfortunately. And it's a mechanic, the mechanic where you have the fire and the wind, and you have to like rotate in a way that you're going to your correct partner. And if you just read it wrong, or if somebody like goes where you're supposed to be, it's really hard to adjust for them. The fight just really leaves very little room for recovery, which is not great. Some of the other mechanics were really good in my opinion. What was it? Pangenesis, I believe. I have the Aether strat, or the PF strat pulled up here, at least with the names. Caloric Theory, Gyokos, which is the UAV mechanic, UAV online, where the arena shrinks, everybody gets real tiny. That was funny. There were some memes with top world prog that tied into that. Caloric I did not like. Exaflares were fine. Pangenesis is the one with the tower soaks that I'm thinking of. That one was cool, I think, where you had to bounce between different towers based on which debuff you had, and then the people with no debuff had to take the tethers and take them away from the group for the big explosions. That was nice. I don't know, this kind of just a middle of the road fight for me. Nothing was incredible. It felt nowhere near as epic as P8, P2, or even P4, P2, in my opinion. Like, it's supposed to be the grand finale of Endwalker Savage, but I don't know, it didn't cut it for me. Phase 1 was a much better final fight, and then this just being another big wall boss in a very similar style to P8, but it just didn't hit the same way P8, P2 did, in my opinion. It didn't feel as epic. Maybe I was just tired by this point in the expansion with all of Ultimate, which we haven't even talked about. But I don't know. This one's just kind of middle of the pack for me, unfortunately. Alright, so that wraps up Savage, and throughout this expansion, Savage was quite a journey. It was quite a learning experience for myself. I learned a whole lot through some of these fights. P3S, P8S, all of the final raids here. I really got a lot of good practice in and improved as a player. But now we come to Ultimate, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these in this video, because talking about these two fights realistically needs its own video. Each one could have its own video. There's so much that goes into these fights. I started progging top. This was my second ever Ultimate after Uwu. We did this back in Abyssos, after Abyssos, when it launched. And I finally cleared it after on and off prog just back in December, so at the end of last year. And then immediately after that, I went into DSR with my friends from my old FC. And we were very casual about DSR, only 2 nights a week, maybe 2.5 hours if we were lucky each night. And we got that done in a couple months, just raiding on extremely casual hours. Some of the people had already cleared it. Top, I spent way more time in, but again, still on a fairly casual schedule, 3 nights a week, 3 hours a night. And we got it done eventually. But these two fights have so much that needs to be said, but without going too far into it, I'm going to put them both in S tier, because that is where they belong. Now, I personally like top more than DSR. Maybe that is a bias of my own, because I cleared top first. It was my first real on-content Ultimate. I'm not going to count Uwu, because level 70, it's widely regarded as the easiest one. Top was real. Like, that was a hard fight. We had over 2,000 wipes in that fight before clearing it. And DSR was much more chill. Maybe I had just learned so much through top that DSR felt easier to me. But overall, as a melee in both, I played Ninja in top, Dragoon in DSR. DSR just felt easier, flat out. Maybe it's not the same for tanks or healers, I really don't know. But for me as melee, top was way harder. Right off the bat, phase 1, insanely difficult. You'll eventually get it down, but you have to repeat that phase every single time. It's like if DSR, it's like if you had to go through the door boss every single time. With DSR, you're dropped in phase 2, there's a door boss. There's so many downtime mechanics throughout the fight. Right off the bat, there's downtime mechanics. Phase 3 is possibly the best designed encounter in this entire game. I will say that. But then phase 4, Eyes, kind of a non-mechanic phase. Sure, you have to pass around some tethers, but you're basically hitting striking dummies the whole time. Phase 5, more downtime. Phase 6 is insane, and then phase 7, when compared to top, final phase, I think top's final phase just crushes DSR's. I don't know. It's so much more tense. It's so much more hype. The mechanics are just harder all around. DSR, you're not doing much other than dodging exaflares. Obviously, there's some tight mitt checks. You got to deal damage, but top just has so much more movement, so much more precision throughout the entire fight, in my opinion. DSR feels way more loose, way more recoverable. Maybe it's the gear that we have. We kind of outgear DSR way more than we do top at this point. We'll have to see how that plays out, but overall, top just felt way more precise, way more exact, down to the letter for every phase. The phases are way more tight. DSR, we were kind of blasting through them, whereas top, it's like you really need to make sure you're saving resources for the next phase, and if you don't, you're kind of screwed, and things need to line up well, or else you're going to be in trouble. DSR, it's kind of just blitz through it, get to the finish, and, you know, hopefully you did it right. I don't know. I don't want to go into these fights in too much detail. I will say top has some incredible phases. DSR has some phases I like less. But overall, both of these fights are the best encounters in this game. They are top of S tier for me. Obviously, we're not ranking, you know, Ultimate versus Extreme versus Savage. These are all kind of separate in each tier, so don't look at this left to right too closely. But top, I think, is my favorite fight in this game currently. I need to get back in there, de-rust it. I've been out of it for too long. But leading into Dawntrail, it's going to be interesting to see what fights are in store for us. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff they could do. Even if they just do more of the same, this last expansion's worth of fights were a blast, so I don't know. I think there's a lot that could be done, but if we get more of this, I honestly won't complain. I know people want drastic change, but I don't know. I had so much fun raiding in this tier. I can see maybe if it's getting stale, if you've been around since ARR and have done a bunch of raid tiers or expansions of raiding. But as my first expansion, I think this was an incredible one. Raiding was just such a blast this whole expansion. There was never really a low point. And there was so much to do with both ultimates and 3 tiers worth of content, and just really fun extremes to farm all along the way. My plan for Dawntrail is to try for the first time ever to week 1 PF everything. So we're going to hop into those extremes, Party Finder, as soon as they come out, try to get those done day 1. Well, depending on if you have to get through the story or not. As soon as I get through the story, I'm going to be hopping in there trying to get those done. Savage, I'm going to try to get that done week 1 in PF. I don't know that I'll get that done. I don't think that'll happen, but we'll get as far as we can. Hopefully through the first 3 fights, at least week 1 in PF. That's the goal. And then we'll see about Ultimate, because we have Eden Ultimate as well to look forward to in 7.1. So depending on how Savage goes in Party Finder, that might be the plan for Ultimate as well. I just kind of want the freedom to do my own thing, to stream it all, to make YouTube videos along the way. And I'll be sure to be sharing the PF adventures here on the channel and on my Twitch stream as well. We're going to have a busy time when Dawntrail comes out. So thank you for sticking by. I know this has been a super long video. Again, shout out to everybody who helped me get footage for this video. That was an event that I organized kind of last minute in Discord, so if you want to be notified of any time that, you know, I might be needing people for a video, if we're just running normal raids or Savage or Extreme or whatever, hop in the Discord and assign yourself one of the raid roles as you join, and you'll get notified. And be sure to subscribe to the channel here on YouTube if you've been enjoying these videos. I appreciate everybody watching. I appreciate everybody who has already subscribed and leaves comments down below. Again, this is just my own very biased tier list, so don't take it too personally if you liked some of these fights that I didn't, or the other way around. I'm sure we've had very different experiences all along the way. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hopefully I will catch you in the Discord or on Twitch when I'm streaming. Be sure to follow on there to get notified when I go live. And yeah, that'll do it for this one. So I will catch you for next week's video, and hope you have a good one. I'm kind of beat after recording this whole video, so yeah, it's been fun though, so hopefully you enjoyed it. Catch you next time. Peace.